Hi guys, Dean McKendry here from Sentient Archery, and this is part 4 of lesson 3. I know it's getting a little bit confusing now, but this is the last part for this lesson, and lesson 3 is basically how to choose the right recurve bow for you. So in part 4 we're specifically talking about poundage. So I guess the best place to start with is let's define poundage. What does bow poundage actually mean? Now, maybe a better word or an alternative word for this is draw weight. So when we talk about draw weight, the reason why it is known as poundage is because draw weight is measured in pounds in the industry of archery. So draw weight basically means how much pressure or how much force is required to pull the string back or to get the limbs to flex backwards. So again, I've got my bow here. So what we're talking about with poundage is we're talking about how much force is required to draw the string back to a full draw position. So when you're holding a full draw, the limbs want to flex themselves back to shape, and that's then going to be applying force on the string, and that then is going to be applying force on your fingers that are holding the string, as well as the same pressure is being applied on the bow arm to want to push it back. So if any of those give, the limb's going to go forward. Obviously, if you were to bend your arm, it's going to also come back. So it's effectively the force required to pull the riser and the string apart from each other, and that poundage comes from the limbs. So limbs are marked with a specific poundage on them, but there's a little bit of confusion about how that all works. So what I've done is I'm going to actually pull this up as well, but I've actually created a little bit of a table here for you guys so that I can sort of indicate or demonstrate how poundage actually works. So what I did was I took a sort of measuring shaft and I put it onto the bow, and I then took a bow scale that measures the force in pounds. I then clipped it on and I drew back to 20-inch draw length, and then I went and measured the poundage at that draw length. I then went up to 21, 22, 23, 24, all the way up to 34 inches, and I measured the weight or the force that was being applied from the string on that bow scale at that distance, and I've then plotted that into a table and into a graph for you guys so you can actually see that. Now I'm going to pull it up, and what you can see is that right from 20 inches it's unlikely that anybody's going to have a draw that's shorter than 20 inches, so it's a good place to start with. It also happens to be where my measuring arrow actually starts its measurement from. So obviously the poundage is quite low at a low 20-inch draw length, but as we go up every inch, that poundage is going to increase. And what you can see with the graph is that the increase is quite uniform across every inch. It goes up almost the same. There's slight variance and sort of it's not a smooth line, and that's just inaccuracy in my ability to hold at exactly that draw length while I'm measuring on the scale. But what you can see is that without a doubt there is an increase in poundage for every inch that I draw further back. Now, when you push past the sort of like maybe 30-inch draw length, you should maybe start to see a steeper curve, and that's not necessarily represented here. These limbs obviously draw quite smooth at the end, but that is the area of the limb that we call stacking, which I referred to in the previous video. Okay, so draw weight is effectively the amount of force that is required to pull the string back. So let's quickly talk about the difference between limb poundage and what we would call on the fingers poundage. Now, basically what that means is that limbs come with a set poundage. So you can get limbs that are marked as 16, 18, 20, 22. They usually go up in 2-pound increments, all the way from very low poundages as low as 12 pounds, all the way up well into the 40s and the 50s in poundage, but they always go up in 2-pound increments. So you're going to buy a set of limbs. So the limbs that I'm using at the moment are 28-pound limbs, and they are long limbs, and so that basically gives me a 70-inch bow when I put them in a 25-inch riser. We've gone into more detail with that in the previous video. So basically I've got 28-pound limbs, but if you take a look at this graph that I just showed you, what draw length are we sitting at 28 pounds? Now what you'll see is that at 28 inches draw length is when I'm roughly sitting at 28 pounds. Now that's not coincidental. Basically, manufacturers put their limbs usually in a 25-inch riser. They then draw them back to 28 inches, and then that is where you're going to get that measurement. So it is dependent on your draw length as to how much poundage you're going to actually get out of those limbs. It's just a benchmarking system so that you know that your limbs are more difficult or easier to draw back and you have a lower or higher draw weight on those limbs. But it is always measured at a 28-inch draw length. So what you can see is anything shorter than that, I've got lower poundage, and anything more than that in terms of how I've drawn, you're going to get an increase in poundage. So on this chart, it's roughly a pound or so increase and decrease in poundage depending on how far I draw back. So for every inch I draw back, I'm roughly increasing my poundage by about 1 pound, maybe 1.5 pounds. Hope that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing, but basically that is then going to be the difference between limb poundage and on the fingers poundage. So for me, I'm a 30-inch draw length. I have a 30-inch draw length. So on these limbs, I'm not drawing 28 inches, I'm drawing 30. So what that means is that I'm now 2 inches longer than the measurement where they took that poundage, which means that I'm drawing nearly 32 pounds on the fingers. And so what that means is that if I draw back to that draw length using my scale and I check that and I go all the way back to my draw length, that's going to take me to close to 32 pounds. So my on the fingers poundage or draw weight on this bow is nearly 32 pounds. But the limbs are marked 28. So that's why I say that's where the confusion can come in. We often get this, guys buy a set of limbs from us and they say, well, it says it's 26 pounds or it says it's 30 pounds, but I'm drawing 3 or 4 pounds more than that, or I'm drawing less than that. So, you know, what's wrong with the limbs? And so that is something that really needs to be understood when you're buying limbs. It's just a comparison system rather than that is exactly the poundage that you're going to have from the bow. All right, so there are also a couple of other factors that are going to affect your poundage in your bow and the poundage of your limbs. So the first factor I kind of touched on in the previous videos is the length of your bow. So like I said before, if I take these limbs and I just put them in a shorter riser, I'm going to get effectively a higher poundage limb. So by going, say, from a 25-inch riser down to a 23-inch riser, you can roughly say that you're going to get a poundage increase of about 2 pounds. So marked on the limb, I'll quickly pull that up here again. You can see that when it says 25H, which is then a 25-inch handle or riser, then the poundage is going to be 28. But if I put this in a 23-inch handle, it's then marking the value of the limbs, the rating of the limbs at 30 pounds. So keeping that in mind is that your limbs might be marked at 28 pounds, but if you're going to put them in a shorter riser, you're going to increase their poundage, their effective poundage, by 2 pounds at that 28-inch draw length that we mentioned before. Obviously, the same thing happens if I put these limbs into a longer riser. If I put them into a 27-inch riser, that's going to effectively reduce their poundage, also again by roughly 2 pounds. So that is definitely one of the factors that you need to be aware of. The other factor is where the manufacturer decides to measure that poundage in terms of the limb bolt setting. So like I said in the previous video when we were talking about functionality of a riser, you have a limb bolt that can be turned in and turned out, and that increases and decreases the amount of angle on the limb, which obviously as you put that limb bolt in, you're going to flex the limb more, and so you're going to effectively increase your poundage, and you're going to, by taking that limb bolt out, you effectively reduce the poundage. Now some manufacturers take that limb measurement at limb bolt all the way out. Some manufacturers do it at a medium setting. So that is also going to play a factor with, you could get a slight variance from manufacturer to manufacturer of maybe 1 or 2 pounds just because of where they take that measurement. So it's never absolute. It's just a rough idea of getting you to that poundage that you need to be at. Okay. Things like bracing height can also have a slight effect on your poundage. So if you were to shoot a lower or higher bracing height, that can also affect your poundage, but those are not usually very big differences. So your biggest factor really is going to be your draw length, then it's going to be your bow length as well. So a shorter bow is also going to start to stack earlier. So if you have a longer draw length, you're going to find a very steep increase in poundage the further back you draw. A longer bow is going to be more forgiving in that space. As you could see on my graph, all the way up to 34 pounds, there wasn't even much of a difference in terms of how much poundage increase there was per inch that I drew back. Obviously, if I kept going, I would then start to get a very steep draw length, but very few people, if any, have a draw length over 34 inches. Let's talk about how this actually applies to you. So now you should understand how limb poundage works and how to kind of get to the desired poundage. But how do you know what the right poundage is for you? Now, this is not an easy question to answer, and it really depends on the individual. The absolute best way to do this would be to go to a club or a shop or go somewhere where you can learn that's got training bows for you. Generally speaking, the coach is then going to give you a bow that they think is manageable for you, something that you can handle without putting too much strain on your body, and allows you to make adjustments to your form. So once you know what that is and you've kind of got a comfortable poundage, it then makes it a lot easier when you're now ready to buy your own equipment. You could then buy something the same, or you could go maybe 2 or 4 pounds higher than what you're currently shooting, and that then gives you an idea. Now, just to give you an idea of how we do things in our training system, generally speaking, an adult man, we would put on a 20-pound bow as a starting point. First time they've ever shot, we give them a 20-pound bow. Sometimes they cope very well with that, and sometimes that's not the case. It depends on a lot of factors. Maybe their draw length is particularly long, so a 20-pound bow, they're not actually drawing 20 pounds, they're drawing 24, 26. We might then put them onto a 16-pound bow to get them closer to a on the fingers poundage of 20 pounds. Generally speaking, with women, adult females, we're usually going to put them on about 16 pounds. Sometimes, again, they're going to cope really well with that. We might push them up to 18 or 20. Sometimes a 14 pounder is required. Again, it just depends on strength and it depends on draw length as well. For our youngsters, our standard is a 14 or 16 pound bow. So that's kind of a starting point. So if you're buying your first bow, generally speaking, I would say go around that range. Nothing more than 22, 24 pounds to start with. Okay, even for a very strong guy, 24 pounds is a lot. You'll be surprised at how little you can do in terms of form adjustment under the strain of a 24-pound bow. Okay, so once you've got that benchmark, then you could go up, and I will always recommend a maximum jump of about 4 pounds from one set of limbs to another. Now you can actually smooth that out quite nicely by playing around with your limb bolts. So you could turn your limb bolts all the way in on your bow until you're getting the maximum poundage. And then when you move over to your next set of limbs that are say 4 pounds higher, you could take those limb bolts all the way out, put those limbs in, and you're probably not even going to have much of a poundage difference, but then you can then slowly increase that poundage by putting the limb bolts back in again. So maybe at an absolute stretch, you could jump 6 pounds as long as you were really playing with those limb bolts to make sure that you're not getting an effective 6 pound jump at a time. That is going to be too much for you to handle while still maintaining good technique and form through that process. Okay, so as you can see, I'm actually also shooting a relatively low poundage. Now I've got some injuries that I'm nursing, so I can't shoot particularly high poundage, but I'm able to perform very well with this bow, especially indoor, and I can shoot 50-meter bare bow, no problem with this bow. In fact, it's a very nice poundage for me because 50 meters is close to my point on distance, which is a whole nother term that I'll get into at some point. But I can perform very well at this poundage. And again, like I've said before in previous videos, poundage being low and manageable, a bow that you can really manage easily, is always going to perform better than somebody who is on a bow that is too heavy or the poundage is too high for them. So quality of your technique and your ability to repeat the same shot over and over again is much more important than effective performance of the bow and arrow speed. Obviously, if you can handle a higher poundage bow and that then equates to higher arrow speed, that is going to be more accurate. But if you're fighting with the bow, it's always better to have lower poundage. All right, so I really hope that makes sense and I've managed to explain that in a clear enough way. Obviously, like always, if you have any questions, just drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, get in touch directly and we can try and assist. If you have a particular question about you and your poundage and would like a little bit more direction, of course, again, throw your information into the comments and we will do our best to respond to that. Okay, so I'm sure by this point you're wanting to understand, how do I know what my draw length is? So all of this in terms of bow length and poundage all hinges around your specific draw length. So the next part or the next video lesson is going to be a lesson specifically about how do you figure out what your correct draw length is, so that you can then figure out what equipment is going to be correct for you. So please stick around for that one. That's going to be in the next lesson. All right, guys, thank you so much. Please subscribe, please like, and got any questions, obviously, like I said, drop them in the comments below.